The courtroom was silent. The tension in the air was almost palpable, as if the furniture itself could feel the gravity of the moment. The judge, a woman with stern eyes and impeccable posture, flipped through the documents in front of her, trying to hide the exhaustion the case had caused her. The clock on the wall struck exactly 2 in the afternoon as she leaned toward the microphone and, in a firm voice, called out, "Next case, Timothy Collins." An assistant opened the side door, allowing a 9-year-old boy to enter. Timothy seemed small and fragile, wearing a blue sweatshirt that looked 2 sizes too big. However, his eyes carried something no one in the courtroom expected to see: raw and genuine determination. He walked toward the witness stand, each step echoing in the nearly empty room. His attorney, a middle-aged woman named Evelyn Parker, stayed by his side, whispering words of encouragement. The judge, without lifting her eyes from the documents, asked, "Mr. Collins, do you know why you're here today?" Before Evelyn could respond or instruct Timothy, he took the initiative. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, his childish voice surprisingly clear. "I'm here because no one believes me." The room froze for a second. The judge looked up, intrigued. "Believe what exactly?" she asked, trying to maintain a neutral tone. Timothy took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. "That you are my mother." His words fell like a bomb in the courtroom. Evelyn's eyes widened, visibly shocked, while the judge leaned back in her chair, unable to hide her surprise. "Excuse me," was all she could say. "You left me," Timothy continued, his voice trembling slightly now, "but I know you're my mother." The murmur of the audience behind the wooden partitions grew louder. Some people whispered, while others exchanged incredulous looks. The courtroom security guard took a step forward, signaling for silence. "Mr. Collins," the judge began, regaining control of the situation, "that is a very serious claim. Do you understand what you're saying?" Timothy nodded vigorously. "I understand. But it's not a claim, it's the truth. Your name is Meredith Harper, right?" The judge hesitated for a fraction of a second, a pause almost imperceptible to most, but enough for Evelyn to notice. She quickly intervened. "Your Honor, I think we need a moment to clarify." "No," Timothy interrupted. "She knows what I'm talking about. You know." Meredith Harper's gaze remained fixed on the boy, longer than was appropriate. Something in her eyes faltered, but she quickly resumed her rigid posture. "Mr. Collins, I fear you are very confused. There is nothing in my history that supports such a statement," she said, her voice attempting firmness but failing to fully convince. "Because they erased everything," Timothy shot back. "I wasn't supposed to find anything, but I did." Evelyn, now entirely out of her depth, whispered, "Timothy, we need to talk about this." "No," the boy exclaimed. "I spent so much time looking, and everything led to her." The silence returned to dominate the room. Judge Harper looked away, pressing her fingers against the bench. Evelyn watched the woman closely, as if trying to piece together a puzzle. Then Timothy added, "I don't want to fight. I just want to know why you left me." Those words broke something in Meredith's composure. Her shoulders dropped slightly, and her eyes now displayed a whirlwind of emotions: surprise, pain, and perhaps, just perhaps, regret. Before she could respond, a male voice echoed through the room. "This is absurd." Everyone turned to the source of the sound. A middle-aged man in a cheap suit stood in the back row of the courtroom. He advanced with determined steps. "Your Honor, I am the legal representative of Mr. Collins. This kind of scene shouldn't be happening here," he said, his voice filled with irritation. Evelyn narrowed her eyes, recognizing the man as Richard Blake, a notoriously manipulative attorney. He continued, "My client, the legal guardian of Timothy, was not informed that such an accusation would be made today." The judge regained her composure and raised her hand. "Mr. Blake, contain yourself. This court will not allow disruptions." Timothy, however, seemed unfazed by Richard's presence. He kept his eyes on the judge. "It doesn't matter what he says. I know who you are." Meredith took a deep breath, finally summoning the strength to speak. "Mr. Collins, Timothy, But the words caught in her throat. Evelyn, seeing the woman's internal struggle, stepped in. "Your Honor, perhaps we should consider a recess. It seems that everyone here needs a moment to process." Meredith quickly nodded, seizing the opportunity. "Agreed. 15 minutes recess." She struck the gavel, temporarily adjourning the session. However, as everyone rose and began to leave, Timothy's eyes remained fixed on her, and for the first time, Meredith looked away, feeling the weight of a past she had tried to bury. But Timothy wouldn't give up so easily. Meredith Harper didn't leave the courtroom immediately. She remained seated in her chair for several minutes, staring at the papers in front of her, as if they were written in a language she couldn't understand. Her hands, usually steady, trembled slightly, and the muffled sound of people moving outside the courtroom brought her back to reality. Evelyn Parker, Timothy's attorney, used the recess to lead the boy to an adjacent room. She knew she needed to prepare him for what was coming next, but she also needed to understand how he had gotten this far. Sitting at a small wooden table, she began. "Timothy, sweetheart, I need you to be honest with me. How did you figure all this out? How did you conclude that Judge Harper is your mother?" He looked at her, his eyes shining with a childlike innocence, but also with the determination of someone who had endured more than he should. "I found some stuff at the orphanage," he began, fidgeting with the zipper of his hoodie. "When I turned 8, they gave me some documents. They said it was everything they had on me, but the papers were full of holes, like pages had been ripped out. Even so, there were some names there, and her name was one of them." Evelyn leaned forward, intrigued. "What kind of document?" "It was like a birth certificate," Timothy replied, nervously wringing his hands. "It wasn't complete, but it had the date I was born and a space with her name, only it was scratched out. I kept wondering why someone would do that, so I started looking." Evelyn felt a pang in her chest. She had worked with many children in vulnerable situations, but something about Timothy's story seemed more complicated, more unsettling. "Did you tell anyone?" she asked gently. Timothy shook his head. "No, I was scared. They didn't like it when we asked questions." The lawyer nodded, trying to hide her indignation. The system, as always, had failed the most vulnerable. But before she could say anything, Timothy continued. "One day I went to the library. I asked the lady who worked there how I could look up people by name. She showed me how to use the computers." "And that's how you found the judge?" Evelyn asked. Timothy nodded, then hesitated. "It took a while. Her name came up in a bunch of places, but always as a judge. When I saw her picture online, I just knew. I just knew." Evelyn took a deep breath, moved by the boy's tenacity but concerned about the complexity of the situation. "Timothy, you understand that even if you believe she's your mother, this has to be proven with evidence, right? It's not enough to just say she is." He lowered his head, but his voice remained firm. "I know. That's why I came here. She's going to tell the truth. I know she will." In the judge's chambers, Meredith stared at herself in the bathroom mirror. Her reflection showed a woman who looked calm and composed, but inside, everything was falling apart. Timothy Collins. The boy's name echoed in her mind, and along with it came memories she had buried nearly a decade ago. She remembered the rainy night in Portland 9 years ago. She was 24, alone, and scared. The unplanned pregnancy had turned her life upside down. Timothy's father, an unstable and aggressive man, had disappeared as soon as he learned she was pregnant. Meredith, a newly graduated lawyer at the time, was struggling to keep her head above water. "I couldn't do it," she murmured to herself, as if justifying the decision she had made. She had left the baby at an orphanage in Oregon, her heart heavy with promises to herself that she would return once her life was more stable. But the years passed, and the excuses piled up. She buried herself in work, using her career as a shield against the guilt that always loomed over her. But now the shield had shattered. A knock at the bathroom door pulled her from her thoughts. "Judge Harper, the hearing resumes in 2 minutes." She nodded, adjusting her hair and trying to erase any trace of emotion from her face. It wasn't just Timothy who needed answers. The court did too. And somehow, she would have to face both. When she returned to the courtroom, Timothy was already sitting in the witness chair with Evelyn by his side. The room was fuller now. Journalists whispered in one corner, and the murmurs of the audience filled the space. Meredith adjusted herself in her chair, taking a deep breath before speaking. Mr. Collins, thank you for your patience. Shall we continue now? Timothy looked at her, and his eyes seemed to pierce through her. We can, Your Honor. Meredith hesitated for a moment before continuing. You said you found information indicating that I am your mother. Is there anything else you'd like to add? Timothy opened his mouth, but before he could respond, Evelyn intervened. Your Honor, I believe what my client needs now are answers. He has done everything he could to bring his story here. Now it's your turn to explain. Meredith felt the weight of those words, as if Evelyn were speaking not just for Timothy, but for the past she had tried to forget. Mr. Collins. Timothy, she began, her voice softer than she intended. What exactly do you want to know? The boy leaned forward, his small fists clenched in his lap. I want to know why you left me. I want to know why you never came back. The room fell silent. Everyone waited for her response. Meredith lowered her head, unable to meet the boy's eyes. It's not that simple, Timothy, she said, her voice breaking. At the time, I thought I was doing what was best for you. Best? Timothy interrupted, his voice rising. Leaving me in a place where no one cares, where no one wants you. Meredith felt the impact of his words like a punch. I'm so sorry, she whispered, almost inaudibly. But Timothy didn't want apologies. He wanted the truth. And deep down, Meredith knew she couldn't hide it much longer. The silence was almost absolute. The tension in the courtroom made the air heavier, every gaze fixed on Meredith Harper, who seemed to be battling internally with the words she wanted or needed to say. She gripped the edge of the bench tightly, as though the furniture was the only thing keeping her grounded. Across from her, Timothy sat in silence, but his expression said it all. He would not back down until he heard the truth. Evelyn, sitting next to him, seemed torn between shielding him and pushing Meredith to provide the answers everyone was waiting for. Finally, Meredith lifted her face. Her eyes were slightly red, and her voice, when it finally emerged, was low, almost a whisper. Timothy, I never wanted to hurt you. The boy clenched his fists in his lap, his voice trembling as he shot back. Then why did you do it? The words hit Meredith like a blow. Evelyn, sensing how delicate the moment was, stepped in to soften the situation. Your Honor, I understand that this is an extremely emotional issue, but my client needs a clear answer. We can proceed privately, if necessary. Meredith shook her head as if trying to regain her composure. After a long sigh, she finally began to speak, this time looking directly at Timothy. Timothy, I was 24 years old when you were born, she said, pausing to breathe. I wasn't ready to be a mother, not even close. Your arrival was a shock, something that left me terrified. Timothy leaned forward, absorbing every word, but his eyes still carried the pain of someone who had been abandoned. That doesn't explain why you never came back, he pressed. Meredith averted her eyes, staring at a fixed point on the wall as if reliving memories buried long ago. I plan to come back, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. After I left you at the orphanage, I promised myself I'd return as soon as I was stable, as soon as I could give you a decent life. But... She hesitated, her voice faltering. The years passed. My career took over my life. I convinced myself you'd be better off without me. Timothy opened his mouth to speak, but Evelyn gently placed a hand on his arm, silently asking him to wait. She knew there was more to come. Your Honor, Evelyn said firmly but calmly, what exactly made you believe you shouldn't return for Timothy? Was it just your career, or was there something else? Meredith closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering the courage to say what needed to be said. His father, she said abruptly. Timothy's father was the reason. Timothy's eyes widened in surprise. He had never heard a single word about his father before. Meredith continued. I was with an unstable, violent man. When I found out I was pregnant, he threatened me, said he would ruin my life and yours, Timothy. He swore that if I tried to raise you, he would find a way to destroy us. So I ran. I left everything behind, including you. The courtroom was silent again. Evelyn looked at Timothy, waiting for his reaction. He seemed to be processing the information, but his face showed a mix of disbelief and frustration. "So you just let him ruin things in another way?" Timothy asked, his voice rising. "You thought the orphanage would be better than being with me?" The boy's words hit Meredith hard, but she tried to stay composed. "You're right," she said simply. "I made a mistake. I made every possible mistake. But I'm here now, and if you let me, I want to fix it." "And how are you going to do that?" Timothy asked, a mix of skepticism and hope in his voice. Meredith looked at him for a moment, unsure how to respond. Then she said the only thing she knew was true. "I don't know, Timothy, but you can help me figure it out. If you give me a chance, I promise I won't leave again." He stared at her, evaluating her. The silence between them was heavy, but something different was present now. A fragile bridge was beginning to form. "Okay," he finally said, "but only if you don't break that promise." Meredith nodded, visibly moved. "I won't." They sat quietly for a few moments until Evelyn stood up. "Your Honor, I believe this case doesn't need to be resolved here, but outside this courtroom, where mother and son can begin to build something together. But that can only happen if both are willing to commit." Meredith hesitated, but then picked up her gavel and lightly struck it against the bench. "Session adjourned," she said, her voice firm but laden with emotion. As everyone rose to leave, Timothy remained seated. He looked at Meredith one last time before saying, "I'm waiting, Mom." Then he stood up and walked out with Evelyn, leaving Meredith alone to face the weight of her choices. The days that followed were a delicate dance of cautious approaches and lingering uncertainties. Meredith was determined to prove she deserved Timothy's trust, but every step forward came with an emotional obstacle. Timothy was not like the children she presided over in her courtroom. He was not a case with a clear beginning, middle, and end. He was a hurt, guarded boy who, above all, longed for someone to show him that he mattered. That Friday, Evelyn coordinated the first formal meeting between Timothy and Meredith outside of the legal environment. They decided to meet at a park in Seattle, an open and neutral place where Timothy could feel less pressured. Evelyn, as usual, was present, but she kept her distance, sitting on a bench reading a book and staying ready to step in if necessary. Meredith arrived early, waiting outside a small cafe in the park. She looked visibly nervous, repeatedly adjusting the strap of her bag and checking her watch every minute. When she finally saw Timothy approaching with Evelyn, her heart started racing. "Hi, Timothy," she said, trying to sound casual, but her voice came out hesitant. "Hi," he replied, keeping his gaze on the ground for a moment before looking up at her. "I thought we could take a walk, maybe get some ice cream or something." "What do you think?" Meredith suggested, trying to diffuse the tension. Timothy shrugged. "Whatever." She swallowed her disappointment. At least it wasn't a rejection. The two began walking side by side. Meredith spoke little, letting Timothy set the pace of the interaction. He looked around, watching the people in the park, but rarely looked directly at her. Even so, he stayed close enough to give her hope that something was starting to build. After several minutes of silence, Timothy finally broke it. "So, did you always want to be a judge?" he asked, his tone lacking much emotion, but carrying a clear curiosity. Meredith smiled slightly, grateful for the question. "I always wanted to help people in some way. My dad was a lawyer, and I think that influenced me a lot. But honestly, it wasn't easy to get where I am." Timothy glanced at her with skepticism. "So why did you leave someone behind? Isn't helping people what judges are supposed to do?" Her smile faded. She knew he was right, but she didn't know how to respond without sounding defensive. "I made a lot of mistakes, Timothy," she admitted sincerely. "And as much as I wish I could, I can't go back and fix them. But I can try to do something now, if you'll let me." He didn't respond immediately, but the fact that he didn't pull away gave her some encouragement. They reached an ice cream stand, and Meredith gestured toward the flavors. "Pick whatever you like, my treat." Timothy looked over the options, deliberating for a moment before choosing chocolate with caramel drizzle. Meredith ordered strawberry for herself, and the two sat at a nearby picnic table. As they ate, she tried to start another conversation. "What's your favorite subject in school?" she asked, searching for a topic that might interest him. He shrugged again. "History, I guess." I like learning about stuff that already happened. It helps explain why things are the way they are now. Meredith smiled, genuinely impressed. History's a great choice. It's important to understand the past to build the future. Timothy let out a short, almost bitter laugh. What if the past is a mess? Can you still fix the future? The question caught Meredith off guard. She set her ice cream aside, leaning forward slightly. Yes, you can, Timothy. No matter how difficult the past was, there's always a way to move forward, but sometimes you need help to do it. He studied her for a few seconds, then looked away. I don't know if I believe that. You don't have to believe it right now, Meredith said softly, but I hope that over time I can show you it's true. That evening, back at the small apartment where Timothy was staying with Evelyn temporarily, the boy lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling. The interaction with Meredith kept replaying in his mind. He wanted to trust her. He wanted to believe she was being sincere. But the fear of being hurt again kept him on guard. Evelyn appeared at the door, holding a cup of tea. "How was the outing?" she asked carefully. "It was okay," Timothy said after a pause. "Just okay?" Evelyn pressed, stepping inside and sitting on the edge of the bed. He shrugged. "I don't know. She seems like she wants to try, but what if it's only for a while? What if she gives up again?" Evelyn sighed, gently brushing a hand over his hair. "Timothy, I know you're scared, and you have every right to be. But from what I saw today, she's really trying. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that trusting people sometimes means taking a leap of faith." He stayed silent for a moment before murmuring, "But what if I fall?" Evelyn smiled gently. "That's what people like me, and maybe her, are here for, to catch you if you do." Timothy didn't respond, but he seemed to be considering her words. The next morning, Meredith sat in her living room, a cup of coffee growing cold on the table beside her. She had spent the entire night revisiting the past, reliving every choice that had brought her to this moment. No matter how much she tried to prepare, nothing felt sufficient to mend 9 years of silence. Picking up her phone, she dialed a number Evelyn had given her. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered. "Hello?" "Timothy, it's me, Meredith. Your mum." There was silence on the other end, and her heart felt like it was about to leap out of her chest. "What is it?" Timothy finally asked. Meredith took a deep breath. "I was thinking, if you want, we can meet again today. But this time, I want to show you something." "Show me what?" he asked, his tone skeptical. "I'll tell you when you get here. It's something I think you should see." After a long pause, Timothy replied, "Okay." When the call ended, Meredith closed her eyes for a moment, feeling a mixture of relief and nervousness. She knew that this meeting would be crucial. She had something important to show him, something that might change everything. In the late afternoon, Timothy arrived at the address Meredith had sent him. It was a simple house in a quiet Seattle neighborhood, with a small front yard and neatly trimmed hedges. He looked around, confused. Evelyn had driven him there, but chose to stay in the car, making it clear that it was up to him to decide what to do next. Meredith opened the door as soon as she saw the car pull up, her face a mix of anxiety and nervousness. "Hi, Timothy," she said, trying to sound calm. "Hi," he replied flatly. "What is it that you wanted to show me?" She smiled faintly, her expression tense, and stepped aside to invite him in. "Come in. I promise it won't take long." Timothy hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The house was cozy, but there was something about it that felt cold, as though it served more as a functional space than a warm home. Meredith gestured for him to follow her into the living room, where a small table was covered with boxes and photo albums. "What's all this?" Timothy asked, frowning. Meredith pulled out a chair and sat down, motioning for him to do the same. "These are the things I kept of you, and from the time everything happened." Timothy sat down slowly, his eyes fixed on the boxes. She opened one and pulled out a small faded blue blanket. "This was yours. You were so tiny that it looked huge on you." Her voice trembled as she held the blanket in her hands. Timothy stared at the object for a long moment but didn't touch it. "Why did you keep this?" he finally asked. Because I couldn't let it go. I wanted to remember you, even when I felt I didn't deserve to. She began pulling more items from the box. A pair of tiny baby shoes, a few small toys, and finally, an envelope filled with photographs. Meredith slid the envelope across the table to Timothy. These are your photos. Some from the hospital, some from the orphanage, and a few of us together. It's not many, but it's all I had. Timothy opened the envelope and started flipping through the photos. There was one of him as a newborn, swaddled in a blanket with Meredith holding him. His eyes lingered on the photo, his face unreadable. You looked happy here, he said, holding up a picture of Meredith smiling at the camera while cradling the baby. I was. For a while, I was, she replied with a deep sigh. But I was also terrified. I had no idea how to be a mother, and when things got hard, I ran. But that doesn't mean I didn't love you. I did. I still do. Timothy placed the photos back in the envelope, his eyes scanning the boxes again. He seemed to be processing everything. It's weird, he finally said. You say you loved me, but I never knew that. I couldn't feel it. His words hit Meredith like a blow, but she knew he was right. I know, and I'm so sorry for that. All I can do now is try to change that if you'll let me. Timothy looked at her, his eyes full of confusion and pain. And if I let you, are you going to disappear again? Meredith shook her head vigorously, tears welling in her eyes. No, I promise I won't. I know I've broken promises before, but this time, I'll do whatever it takes to stay. They sat in silence for a moment before Timothy finally said, Okay, I think I want to try, but I don't know if I can trust you yet. And that's okay, Meredith replied, her voice trembling. We can go at your pace. Just let me be here for you. In the weeks that followed, Timothy's visits to Meredith's house became more frequent. Slowly, he began to feel more comfortable. They cooked together, played card games, and sometimes simply sat on the couch watching TV. It wasn't perfect, and there were days when Timothy still pulled away, but the progress was undeniable. Meredith, on her part, was determined not only to be a presence in his life, but also to take concrete steps. With Evelyn's help, she began gathering the necessary paperwork to apply for legal custody of Timothy. The most memorable day came on a sunny Saturday. Timothy and Meredith were at the park, playing a makeshift game of basketball. For the first time in a long time, Timothy was laughing, and Meredith felt a warmth in her chest as she watched him enjoy himself. When they stopped to take a break, Timothy looked at her, wiping sweat from his forehead. You know, I didn't think you'd keep trying. Meredith smiled, kneeling down to be at his eye level. I said I would try, and I'll keep trying every single day. Timothy was quiet for a moment before giving her a small smile. Okay. Then I guess you can be my mom again. His words caught her completely off guard. Tears streamed down her face, but they were tears of relief and joy. Thank you, Timothy. I promise I won't let you down. He shrugged, trying to seem indifferent, but the small smile remained on his face, and for the first time, both of them felt like they had found something they thought they'd never have. A family. In the late afternoon, Timothy arrived at the address Meredith had sent him. It was a small house in a quiet neighborhood with a well-kept front yard and neatly trimmed hedges. He stood outside for a moment, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. Evelyn, who had driven him there, waited in the car, giving him space to decide if he wanted to go inside. Meredith opened the door as soon as she saw him approach. Her expression was a mix of nervousness and cautious hope. Hi, Timothy, she said gently, stepping aside. I'm glad you came. Hi, he replied, his voice neutral. What is it that you wanted to show me? Meredith smiled faintly, though her hands fidgeted as she gestured for him to enter. Come in. It's something I think you should see. Timothy hesitated briefly, but then stepped inside. The house had a warm, minimalist feel, with soft lighting and carefully chosen decorations. Still, it felt slightly impersonal, like a space that hadn't fully embraced its purpose as a home. Meredith led him into the living room, where a small table was covered with photo albums, documents, and a few old keepsakes. What is all this? Timothy asked, his voice wary. Meredith motioned for him to sit down as she took a chair across from him. "These are the things I kept from when you were born. They're pieces of you and of our story. Things I thought I'd never have the chance to share with you." Timothy frowned slightly but sat down, his eyes fixed on the table. Meredith reached for a small box and opened it carefully, pulling out a faded blue baby blanket. "This was yours," she said, her voice soft and trembling. "You used to wrap up in this all the time. You were so small that it looked huge on you." Timothy stared at the blanket but didn't reach for it. "Why did you keep it?" he asked quietly. Meredith sighed deeply, her hands gripping the blanket as though it held all the answers. Because I couldn't let it go. I wanted to hold on to you somehow, even when I thought I didn't deserve to. This blanket, these things, they were all I had of you." She placed the blanket back in the box and pulled out an envelope filled with photographs. Sliding it toward Timothy, she said, "These are for you. They're pictures of us, from the short time we had together. Some are from the hospital, and a few are from when you were just a few months old. I thought, maybe you'd want to see them." Timothy hesitated, but eventually took the envelope and started flipping through the photos. One showed Meredith holding him as a newborn, smiling despite the exhaustion visible on her face. Another showed him bundled in the same blue blanket she had just shown him. He lingered on one particular photo of her, holding him in the hospital, a wide smile on her face. "You looked happy," Timothy said quietly, almost accusingly. "I was," Meredith admitted. "I loved you from the moment I saw you. But I was scared, Timothy. I was so scared. I didn't know how to take care of you, and when things got hard, I ran." Timothy's grip on the photos tightened as he looked at her. "You say you loved me, but I never knew that. I never felt it." His words cut deeply, but Meredith didn't flinch. She nodded slowly, acknowledging his pain. "You're right," she said softly, "and I can't change that. I can't undo the years I wasn't there, but I can try to make up for them now. If you'll let me." Timothy looked down at the photos in his lap, his face a mixture of confusion and sadness. "What if I let you and you leave again? What if you get scared again?" Meredith leaned forward, her voice trembling but firm. "I won't. I know I've broken promises before, but this time I'll do whatever it takes to keep this one. I'm not going anywhere, Timothy. Not ever again." They sat in silence for a long moment before Timothy finally spoke. "I don't know if I can trust you yet," he admitted. "That's okay," Meredith replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to trust me now, I just need the chance to earn it." Over the weeks that followed, the relationship between Timothy and Meredith slowly began to grow. They spent more time together, cooking meals in her kitchen, playing games in the living room, and even sharing quiet moments reading or watching TV. It wasn't easy. There were still moments of doubt and hesitation, particularly from Timothy. But with every small interaction, the walls between them began to come down. Meredith, for her part, worked tirelessly to prove she was serious about being in Timothy's life. She coordinated with Evelyn to begin the legal process of applying for custody, gathering every necessary document and attending every required meeting. It was a long and exhausting road, but she didn't waver. One bright Saturday afternoon, Timothy and Meredith were at the park, playing a casual game of basketball. For the first time, Timothy's laughter filled the air, a sound Meredith hadn't realized she'd been longing to hear. When they finally took a break and sat on a nearby bench, Timothy turned to her, wiping sweat from his brow. "You know, I didn't think you'd keep trying," he said, his tone lighter than usual. Meredith smiled, leaning down to be at his eye level. "I told you I'd try, and I'll keep trying every single day." Timothy hesitated, then gave her a small smile, the kind that felt like a hard-won victory. "Okay, then I guess you can be my mom again." Meredith froze, the weight of his words settling over her. Tears welled up in her eyes, but this time they were tears of relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Timothy," she whispered. "I promise I won't let you down." He shrugged, trying to play it cool, but the small smile stayed on his face. For the first time, both of them felt that they had something neither had expected to find: a family.